All right, today we're going to be talking about how to process lead vocals for a pop song. Lead vocals are really hard to nail anyway because, one, they're the thing that people listen to generally first. They want to hear how the vocals sound. If the vocals don't sound great, then the song doesn't sound great. So there's a lot of pressure on mixing the vocals right. And the vocals also take up a huge range in the frequency spectrum, crowding with synths, guitars, drums, just about everything else. And in pop in particular, a lot of the polish and kind of commercial vibe that we associate with pop music is coming from the vocals. So there's a very specific way, I think, to approach mixing vocals for a pop song. I have a pop song pulled up here. It's a series of tricks and a process to follow just like anything else. So we're going to break the whole thing down. First, I'm going to play a snippet of the song so you can hear what the vocals sound like all together. All right, now let's break down that whole chain piece by piece. So the very first thing, I'm turning everything off here so we can hear what it sounds like dry. The very first thing I'm going to do is tune the vocals. I like to be really gentle with the tuning. Every pop song has auto-tune, so if you're against auto-tune, you should get over it. But here's what it sounds like totally dry. All right, and that's me singing. I'm obviously not a pop vocalist, certainly not a primetime singer. I'm usually singing metal, which doesn't require a lot of singing. And that's the reason I put this tutorial together, because you don't actually have to have an absolutely amazing vocal take to get a nice sounding pop tune. So first thing I'm gonna do is throw the auto-tune on there. I'll do a separate video on how to get the most out of auto-tune, but I'm always going to use graph mode, and I'm going to use as little tuning as possible. I just like to use it to fix mistakes. If you're doing like really over-the-top Charlie XCX style vocals, it's nice to really lean into the auto-tune. That's not what I'm doing for this song, so I'm just going to move past it. Now, the next couple pieces of processing or plugins I'm going to put on this vocal chain are designed to replicate the physical studio experience. So I'm the owner of Very Friendly Studios. We have a bunch of analog gear there. And when I'm recording in the studio, I'm not using plugins right out of the gate like this, right? I'm using a microphone that's going into a preamp. We use Neve preamps that's then going to an EQ sometimes, or I'm using the EQ on a mixing board that's then going into a compressor that's then going into the DAW. So all of that outboard gear is doing a lot of stuff before it even hits Logic. And one of the things that I've noticed is true in a lot of YouTube tutorials is that they really focus on a DAW first kind of approach, where you put the plugins in the order that sounds best in the DAW. I would prefer to put the plugins in the order that they would actually be if I was recording this physically. And I think that that's a way to get a real studio kind of sound on your vocals versus an in-the-box sound. So the first thing is going to be a preamp, right? So I have a plugin that is emulating a preamp. This one is the virtual channel emulator from Slate Audio. And what this is doing, I have it dialed to Brit N here. That's a Neve emulator. So this is emulating the Neves that we have in our studio. And I'm just going to dial this a little bit until I'm seeing it peak around -5 to maybe -12 decibels. What would you say is your biggest weakness? So that's just adding a little bit of analog warmth. All of the moves we're going to make out of the gate are not going to have a tremendous impact on the sound, but they're going to add up to a tremendous impact, right? So we're making incremental moves to really create the sound. The next thing I'm going to do is EQ. I'm going to use an analog EQ emulator, again, as if I'm on an SSL console. So I have the SSL E channel strip pulled up here. I like the black setting versus the brown. This is obviously a classic piece of analog technology on their mixing board. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial these so that I'm getting some air on the top end of the vocals. Air is very important to pop vocals, and you're going to find the air probably between 8 and 12K. So we're going to boost with a high shelf there. I'm then going to bring a little bit of grit to these vocals so that they sound a little bit organic, and I'm going to find that between 3 and 5K. Then I'm going to boost somewhere in the mid-range for a little warmth, usually 1 to 2K. And finally, I'm going to take some mud out between 2 and 500. So I'm just going to do all of those together in context. This is where it's really good to hear the full song together while you're mixing. So let's just play around with these. Okay, Okay, we're starting to get the EQ sound I like. The next thing we're going to do is go to compression. We're not going to mess around with anything else, and this is because the compressor is usually the last thing in the outboard chain that you're going to hit before you get into the box. So I like to, rather than using an 1176 or a distressor, one of those really fast type of compressors, when I'm doing pop, I like to use something warmer and more vintage sounding. So I like the CL1B. This emulator from TubeTech is really good. High ratio. This is the first of many compressors. We're going to have 4 stages of compression when all is said and done on this pop vocal track. But the first one's going to do the heavy lifting. So put the ratio at 6:1, fast attack, because we don't want those plosive pops at the beginning of the lines. Now, mid-level release, and I'm just going to dial the threshold until we're getting, 5 to even 10 decibels gain reduction.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness? 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 Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
Okay, too loud, we're clipping, but that's the right level of compression. So let's just get the gain dialed now.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
Okay, so that's taming the dynamics a little bit and giving it some warmth. So now we're pretending that we're going into the box. We're done with our outboard chain. The first thing I'm going to do in the box is I am going to pull up that surgical graphic-oriented EQ. Pro Q3 is my favorite for that. And pretty simple here. I don't like to EQ like crazy because then you start to lose the unique characteristics of the vocals. So I'm doing a dynamic dip at 330 to take out some mud, taking out some boxiness at 710. And look, this is 1.5 decibels. We're not going crazy. Very gentle dynamic dip here at 2200, give or take. That I'm sure is for harshness. And then we're starting to do some work on the S's and P's, the plosives, up in this like 6 to 8K range with a dynamic dip there. So let's hear what that sounds like. First disengage, and then we'll engage it.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness? Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
Okay, we're starting to fit in the mix a little bit better there. Next, I'm going to do a third stage of EQ. This time I'm going to use Soothe 2. Soothe 2 is great because it kind of algorithmically detects frequencies and reduces them dynamically, and you just use these nodes to kind of find the right ranges. So I'm boosting in Soothe 2 at 3K and at 5K, and when you boost in Soothe 2, what that actually means is that you're increasing the level at which you're cutting that zone. So it looks like I'm just working on some harshness here. You'll be able to visually see where those frequencies are coming out.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
So again, just making it mold into the song a little bit better. I'm going to actually solo this so you can hear the frequencies we're taking out, which is a good way of understanding what it is that Soothe 2 is doing.
Biggest weakness. Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
See, just taking out some of that harshness.
Why
Okay, so we've now gone through 3 stages of EQ. We're now going to enter our... Actually, no, we're going to do the DeEsser first. So I'll throw a DeEsser in before the second compressor because anything that you compress is going to be accented, and I don't want to accent the S's. I want to cut them out before I compress. So I swept around here to find where those S sounds were in like the 6300, 6400 range, and I play with the threshold until I'm getting, 15 to 20 decibels of reduction on those S sounds. It sounds extreme, but in the context of a pop song, for the lead vocal especially, I really like to get those S's out because they really overwhelm everything else. So here's what it sounds like with the DeEsser added.
would you say is your biggest weakness?
And it almost sounds like a lisp, but that's actually going to be fine when I add all the other layers of vocals back in because they're all going to be adding incremental amounts of that S sound. That's why it's important to get as much of it out on the lead vocal as you can, right? Okay, so after that, we're now going to add our second stage of compression, and this is where a lot of people will use the LA2A. It's obviously a great compressor. I've been really into this plugin called Dopamine, and this is it's not only a compressor, it also applies some kind of harmonic saturation that I don't totally get, or some EQ that I don't totally get, that puts a lot more air on here. I love air in pop vocals. And the mix voice preset that is native to this plugin is a good place to start. I usually wind up with compression dialed at around 75% and the wet, somewhere around 50%. And just listen to what happens to this when I turn it on. You're going to hear that air rush in.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness? Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
So we're getting even more tame dynamics, and we're getting that really nice kind of like air quality at the top end of the vocals. So after that, we're going to apply the last level, I should say, track level compression. So third compressor number 3 now. This is a multi-band compressor, and the reason multi-band compressors are great is because you can process these frequency bands independently, right? So I have 3 frequency bands I'm focusing on in this case. Usually I'm going to put one somewhere for mud. That's what this band is doing. We have a band focused on 312 where the mud is. We have a band focused on 820 where there's some boxiness left over, and we have a band focused at 7700 where we're still probably getting some of those plosives. And I have these dialed independently to just like very surgically tame the song. Rather than cutting the frequencies, we're just compressing them. So here's what it sounds like with the multi-band added.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness? Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
All right, so the next one, the last thing I'm going to put on the track, which is a favorite of mine, a little bit of a secret weapon for lead vocals, is I'm going to put some slapback, but I'm going to bring the mix and the feedback low enough that it's not actually slapping back. So here's what it would sound like if we were really throwing some slapback on here, right?
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
But see, that's way more dramatic than what I want. I actually want to pull these back until just below the level of really hearing pronounced slapback, maybe around here.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
And so all that's doing is adding some thickness to the lead vocal, making it wrap around the song a little bit, which I like for pop music. Let's hear what that sounds like in context.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
All right, so that's all the track level processing that's on the track. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to have a handful of wet effects that are being applied on auxiliary send. So rather than putting reverb and delay or some combination thereof on the track itself, I'm always going to use an auxiliary send. So I'm going to create a new auxiliary channel, like channel 44 here, call that Verb 1 or something. And I have a Valhalla vintage Verb plugin on that channel. The first one's just ambience. It's pretty gentle, just like a second of delay on there. Minimal pre-delay. And what's nice is I can now kind of blend this into taste using this knob versus having it live on the channel, right? Let me pull that up, make sure I got the right one. I didn't. So the first one is actually an even shorter ambience at half a second. So almost imperceptible. If I play it solo, you'll probably hear it.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
So it's getting pushed a little bit further into the song using the ambience, but in context, it's not really noticeable.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
It's just making it sound like a little more glued in. That's the key with pop vocals, is when you apply all this processing, it's really easy to have it sitting on top of the song. We're gluing it in using this ambience. I also like stereo delay here. Stereo delay is nice, not to actually create delay, but just to create glue, right? So I'm going to set these to millisecond versus actually on tempo, and somewhere between 150 and 200 on both sides, and just have a subtle variation in delay time between the left and the right. And that just creates a little bit more depth. Here's what it sounds like soloed.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
So you can hear those delays, but when I play it in context, you really can't. All that happens is it tucks into the song a little better.
Why would you say is your biggest weakness?
Okay, so I had one relatively short reverb. I'm going to add one longer reverb. So I have one here at 1.7. And what I've also done is I've added some multiband compression to the actual send. So I have the separate send with the reverb on it. And what I'm doing here, let's actually crank this up to like 4 to make it a little more obvious. What I'm doing here is I'm side chaining this auxiliary send to the lead vocal. So what that means is when the lead vocal is present, it's going to push this reverb down, and it's going to snap back when the vocal closes, which means we're going to hear the line clearly, but then we're going to hear a nice reverb tail on the end. So here's what that sounds like.
Why would you say it's your biggest weakness?
All right. And then last but not least, what did I do here? I have one more ambience just because I felt like it. And this one looks like it's a little bit longer. You can really stack as many reverb and delay sends as you want here. Since they're sends, they're not going to crowd the channel too much, and you can really control how present they are. So here's what it sounds like with all of those together. Turn off the bus stuff here.
Why would you say it's your biggest weakness?
Okay, so at this point, it should be starting to sound like pop, right? I'm now going to go to the bus level just very quickly and show you what I'm doing here. I could do a separate video on this, but very minimal. I'm just doing some cleanup EQ. You can see I'm taking out some whistles here. Here's what I mean by whistles. I'll just boost this so you can hear it.
Why would you say it's your biggest weakness? Why would you say it's your biggest weakness?
So that like ice picky whistly sound, we're just taking that out with some dynamic dips here, and we're leaving most of this really alone. Just a slight dynamic dip here for mud. The main thing is doing some additional multi-band compression here to clean up mud across all of the vocal traps together, because when you stack this up with all the background vocals, they really start to add up. You just want to make sure you're getting rid of that mud. And then last but not least, I love the Mag EQ4 air shelf. Always going to put it at probably 10K and then just a half a decibel boosting here. So let's hear what our finished product is. I'm going to bring the backup vocals in again, and here we go.
Why would you say it's your biggest weakness? Why would you say it's your biggest weakness? Why would you say it's your biggest weakness? Why would you say it's your biggest weakness?
All right, there you have it. Sounds like pop to me.